As you may know, the lectionary, the readings we use on Sundays, on weekdays, was composed in the way that the Old Testament finds its fulfillment in the New one. So the readings, the first, the second, the Gospel reading, are somehow intertwined. We have some prefiguration at the beginning and then some explanation, fulfillment in the second reading and the Gospel. And today a preacher could be exceptionally pleased because it seems it's all easy, right? All clicks. We have this model of sacrifice, Abraham and Isaac, and then we hear from St. Paul in the second reading that God the Father did not spare his own Son, but he handed him over for us all. See the connection? It's similar, right? And then we have this model of obedience Abraham displays when he's being tested, and yet he follows, he trusts. And then we hear in the Gospel the voice from the cloud coming and saying, listen to him, this is my Son, be obedient. So again, a preacher could be pleased and just say, well, you've already got the connection, so let's just continue our Mass. But I think there is something more, there are some layers in this drama that we need to unpack. Now, how to be obedient? We know we should be. We get this. We hear that much. But how to achieve that level of trust? How to place our very lives in the hands of God, who sometimes seems to expect the impossible, like with Abraham and his son Isaac. How to be obedient? Well, I think the story of the Transfiguration here brings a very new, bright light into this very question of how we can follow the will of God. Now, a side note, I don't know if you've heard this term, the acronym is MTD. It stands for Moralistic Therapeutic Deism. Some sociologists, when they analyze the American religion these days, let's say this kind of general model of how we tend to think about God, they say, well, it has 3 specific traits. It's a lot of kind of moral emphasis. So people feel like God is the one who is specifically focused on the do's and don'ts, regulations, rule. Then also this kind of second trait would be something that comforts us. We expect our religion, our relationship with God to give us peace, to solve our problems, to somehow take care of our tensions and anxieties. And the third trait of the image of God that we have as a society is actually a deistic one. We believe that God exists, but quite often we place him away as this kind of distant watchmaker who had created this whole universe, and it works somehow, it clicks, like a machine, but he is not particularly involved. So those are like the predominant images of God our society probably has. Now, we as practicing Christians, Catholics, probably come to some more subtle, more theologically complex images and models of God, and yet we are immersed in our society. So I think when we ask the question of obedience, how to please God, how to follow his laws, we may, to some extent, be influenced by those predominant images of God that people around us have. So that was a side note, the MTD, Moralistic Therapeutic Deism, false images of God. Too shallow, too one-dimensional. It's not enough. So let's look at the Transfiguration, because I really believe this story gives us a powerful insight how the obedience works and what kind of obedience God expects from us. First of all, the Transfiguration happens on a mountain, and it's not the first time something important in the Bible happens up on a mountain, right? Moses received the law, the tablets, on Mount Sinai. Elijah was called, he got his commission as a prophet on a mountain. Well, back then, when we read the first reading, Abraham, at the very beginning of the whole journey of faith of the people of Israel, Abraham was called to sacrifice his son Isaac on a mountain, Mount Moriah. And finally, today, Jesus is on a mountain. What is the symbolism of a mountain? Obviously, it's a place where you can almost touch the supernatural. Daily lives, daily routines, the tracks that we follow are left behind. So we are up there, we breathe in this fresh air, and we are challenged to see the beauty and even the scope of creation. It's really hard to be indifferent and not somehow religious when you hike, when you climb a mountain. Now, it's just the natural meaning of a mountain, and yet the supernatural always builds on the natural. Jesus invites us to follow him to the mountain, to leave behind false images, daily routines, and perhaps be challenged anew and afresh when we ask the question of how we obey the Father. Let's go up to the mountain. Let's take yet another attempt to understand our relationship with our Heavenly Father. And St. Luke, when he gave us his account of the Transfiguration, so not St. Mark's Gospel that we read today, but St. Luke parallel, it gives us one detail. Luke mentions that Jesus went up to this mountain to pray. To pray. To be intimately with the Father. Now, often when we think obedience, we don't think prayer. We think following rules. We think meeting requirements. Now, Jesus redirects that thinking. He comes to pray, to be intimately close in a dialogue with the Father who sent him. Another clue, right? Let's follow him up to the mountain to pray, because that's when the Transfiguration happens. And Jesus' face becomes bright. Now, that's not the first time in the whole history of our faith when someone is encountering God and his face is being transformed. Moses was actually the one who, upon receiving the tablets, when he came back to the camp, the Israelites could not even look at him because his face was radiating with some supernatural light. But there's a huge difference. It was not Moses' light. It was the light of God reflected on the face of Moses, like the moon reflects the sun. Jesus here is radiating his own divine light because he is light. Light from light. God from God, as we say in the Creed. Jesus, in his relationship with the Father, reveals his true identity, true light, this inner divinity that is now concealed in his humanity. Our obedience to the Father comes through Jesus, but we also participate in his light. It's not just about the knowledge of the commandments and the rules. It's a participation in the light that God shares with us. And then the white garments. St. Mark is trying to depict the clothes of Jesus that become dazzling white, such as no fuller on earth could bleach them, beyond understanding, beyond any sensual possibility of description. Now, if you remember what St. John wrote in the book of the Revelation, when he described heaven, everybody there up in heaven is wearing white garments. Not just white because of the material, the fabric that they're made of, but white because those garments have been washed in the blood of the Lamb. We receive the same garments. When we approach our Father through Jesus, we participate in the sacrifice of his blood because he is the Lamb sacrificed for us. The Lamb somehow prefigured in the story of Isaac and Abraham. He is the Lamb whose blood makes us new. So we are being restored to this lost original holiness. What we lost back in the Garden of Eden through disobedience. Now, through Jesus' blood, we receive back the new identity. That's what happens to us. We are being washed from our doubts and sins and darkness. And we become new creation. Foretaste of heaven. Now, again, St. Luke, who gave us more details than St. Mark about the story of Transfiguration, he mentioned also what Elijah and Moses were talking about with Jesus. They were talking about his exodus, his departure, his transition, namely his passion. And we know what Exodus means in the whole history of salvation for those disciples of Jesus, pious Jews. The Exodus stood for the passage to the Red Sea, from slavery of Egypt to the freedom of Canaan, the promised land. Jesus is like this new Moses who wants to lead us through the passage of his cross. His cross becomes the new Red Sea, from slavery to sin into the perfect freedom of beloved daughters and sons of God. Peter is ecstatic. Peter is out of his mind when he sees that. And he says a clumsy thing, as usually Peter does in the Gospels. He means well, right? But then he comes across as kind of, really, Peter, building tents in this moment, this transcendent spiritual experience, pitching tents. Is that all, Peter? Really? But perhaps, to his defense, there is something really profound that he is saying, even though it sounds clumsy. Some scholars who kind of trace those events in the Gospels and they try to create a timeline would say that the Transfiguration happened at the very time when the Jews would gather in Jerusalem for the Feast of the Tabernacles, Feast of the Tents, one of the major Jewish feasts commemorating what happened back in the desert when the people of Israel were walking towards the promised land, how God took care of them, how God provided for their needs. So that was one of the major Jewish feasts when people of Israel would actually travel, making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and for 8 days they would live in tents, remembering those times, centuries before, when they were just wanderers in the desert. But also there is a meaning of those tents people would live in for 8 days, a meaning of anticipation. This eschatological heavenly tent where we will dwell in the presence of the Lord. So Peter, as a pious, practicing Jew, perhaps he had that kind of thing in mind when he said, seeing the radiant face of Jesus, "Lord, it is good to be here. Let's just pitch a tent here because the kingdom has arrived." He recognized that what the Feast of the Tabernacles, Feast of the Tents every year symbolized, has just arrived. The Messiah is here. Of course, he wants to capture this moment, keep it forever, but also here Peter professes the faith. Yet Jesus says, we can't stay here. We have to go down because the only passage, the only Red Sea, the only way to freedom, the only kingdom is the cross. There is no way around it. And this is the lesson, perhaps. We receive this light of God, the new garments, the new identity, when we walk with Jesus through his cross. And the cross is the essence of obedience. Perhaps the cross is what was required of Abraham. Not just literally the life of his son Isaac, but perhaps what God wanted from Abraham was this total surrender of his hopes and dreams and plans. Well, Isaac was the son of the promise. Abraham had waited decades to have this child. And now God says, give him back to me. Give him back to me. Trust me. Surrender your ideas, your dreams, your hopes. I will lead you. That's a cross. And that's the kind of obedience God expects from us. Not because he is an angry, distant God. Not because we have to meet his requirements and follow the do's and avoid the don'ts. But because he is loving God, the Father who gave his Son, so that in him, once we surrender everything, we may receive our new identity. The new garments, white garments, no sin, freedom. Freedom for love, freedom for excellence. That's the message of the cross. And Pope Benedict, when he was writing a little commentary on the story of the Transfiguration, he used a phrase I love. It's an amazing, mind-blowing phrase. He says, the experience of becoming light from and with the Lord. That's how he defines the Transfiguration. The experience of becoming light from and with the Lord requires us to be burned by the light of the Passion and so transformed. Burned by the light of the passion, and so transformed our thinking. That's what happens to Abraham when he's obedient. His thinking is being transformed. That's what happens to Peter and James and John when they follow Jesus to the cross. Their thinking, their expectations are being transformed. But first we have to be burned by the fire of the passion from within. This Lent, I invite you to approach this mystery, the obedience to the Father through Jesus, not some kind of impersonal obedience, but obedience with the Son, so that we may be burned inside by the light of the passion and the love of Jesus Christ, and thus that we may receive our new identity and the new meaning of freedom